The cafe had no name on the sign, just a street number and the word colored. In Hattiesburg, Mississippi, 1952, the woman who ran the kitchen started the stove before dawn because travelers on Highway 49 pulled in hungry while it was still dark. She cooked what she had that morning, no printed menu. The Green Book listed her address, but not her name. The plate at number 14 divided every person who sat down at that counter. At number 7, a 35-cent bowl carried a driver 200 miles on roads where the next safe stop was half a state away. These cafes did not close because the food failed. They closed because the country changed, and nobody thought to write down what was cooking when the last door shut. Hit subscribe because these dishes paid the price for that change. Here are 25 forgotten Green Book cafe dishes from the 1950s that vanished forever. Number 25, pepper steak plate. In Green Book cafes from Memphis to Mobile, this was the Tuesday special nobody skipped. Bell peppers sliced thick, round steak pounded thin, the whole thing simmered in tomato sauce with garlic salt and black pepper until the meat went soft. The plate came with white rice and a dinner roll. 50 cents, 60 on the coast. Pepper steak was a cafe dish, not a home dish, because most families could not justify round steak on a weeknight. The cafes bought it by the case and stretched to 10 pounds across 30 plates. When the last Green Book Cafe on Forest Street in Jackson closed in 1972, pepper steak left the menu and never came back. You can find pepper steak at Chinese American carryouts today, but the Southern Cafe version, slow braised and seasoned for a different palate, exists only in memory. Number 24, pig's ear sandwich. The travelers who pulled into a Green Book cafe near the Delta and saw this on the chalkboard knew they were in a real kitchen. Pig's ears scrubbed clean, boiled for hours, pressed flat between 2 plates overnight, then sliced and fried until the edges crisp. Served on white bread with yellow mustard and a pickle spear. The texture sat somewhere between pork rind and cartilage. Ears were scrap parts that butchers kept for anyone who asked. The sandwich was pure profit for the cafe because the ingredient itself was treated as waste. After the cafes closed, pig's ears went back to home kitchens, then faded out entirely as the next generation left the South and left offal behind. Before this list goes any further, for anyone who wants dishes like these in one place, the recipes that keep showing up on this channel have been gathered in a book called Big Mama's Soul Food Kitchen at thehungryhistorian.com. This is the only mention. If that sounds right, it is there. Now, back to the list. Number 23, fried corn. Not cream corn from a can, not corn on the cob. Fried corn in a Green Book cafe meant fresh kernels cut straight off the ear and cooked in rendered fat with a little sugar and salt until the edges browned and the natural starch thickened into something close to pudding. It came as a side on nearly every plate from June through September. The cook needed nothing but a sharp knife, a hot skillet, and corn that was picked that morning. When the cafes closed, fried corn held on in home kitchens for another generation, but by the 1990s, frozen and canned corn had replaced the fresh ear entirely. The dish requires corn picked the same day to work. Stale kernels do not release enough starch. That is why it never traveled. Number 22, rice and tomato gravy. A bowl of white rice under a ladle of gravy made from canned tomatoes, rendered fat, flour, salt, and black pepper. That was lunch at dozens of Green Book cafes across South Carolina and Georgia. Some cooks added a slice of onion or a splash of Worcestershire. Most did not. The gravy was thin, almost a soup, and it stained the rice pink. Families called it tomato gravy or red gravy, depending on the county they came from. No restaurant today puts rice and tomato gravy on the menu. It is too simple, too poor, too honest about where it came from. The market decided it was not worth selling. Number 21, sweet potato pone, not a pie, not a casserole, a pone, raw sweet potatoes grated by hand on a box grater, mixed with cane syrup, cinnamon, ginger, and a little butter, then baked in a heavy pan until the top cracked and the center set to something between custard and cornbread. Green Book cafes in Alabama and Mississippi served a pone as dessert, but most travelers ate it as a side because it went with everything. The word pone comes from the Algonquin apan, meaning baked. By the 1960s, sweet potato pie had replaced pone on nearly every cafe menu because pie was easier to slice and serve. Pone had to be scooped. It looked rough, but it tasted like the potato itself, not like sugar and eggs. That was the whole point, and that is exactly what disappeared. Here is something worth understanding about these cafes. The Green Book was published from 1936 to 1966, 30 years of a travel guide that existed because Black Americans needed to know where they would not be turned away, arrested, or worse. The cafes listed in it were not restaurants in any modern sense. They were kitchens that happened to have a counter. Many operated out of the front room of a private home. The menu changed depending on what the cook had that morning. The prices covered the cost of groceries, not profit margins. When the Civil Rights Act of 1964 opened every lunch counter in the country, Black travelers no longer needed the Green Book. The guide stopped publishing, and hundreds of Black-owned cafes that had survived on the simple fact of being necessary quietly closed because necessity was no longer enough. Number 20, Country Captain Chicken. This dish entered the South through the port of Savannah, where spice traders brought curry powder from India in the early 1800s. By the 1940s, Green Book cafes in Georgia served their own version. Chicken pieces browned in a skillet, then stewed with tomatoes, onions, green peppers, currants, and a heavy shake of curry powder, served over white rice with a handful of toasted almonds on top. Country Captain was the only curry dish most Black travelers ever encountered at a Southern table. But by the 1970s, curry powder had fallen out of Southern cooking almost entirely. The dish retreated to a handful of church supper tables and then vanished. Today, most people under 60 have never heard of Country Captain, and most over 60 have not tasted it since childhood. Number 19, salmon croquettes with white gravy. In every Green Book cafe from the Carolinas to East Texas, there was one dish that could be made on any day in any season with ingredients that never spoiled: salmon croquettes. Canned salmon mashed with egg, onion, cracker crumbs, and black pepper, shaped into flat patties and fried golden. The gravy was flour, butter, milk, and salt. Nothing more. The plate came with 2 croquettes, a pool of white gravy, and a biscuit on the side. This was the dish that kept small cafes alive. A case of canned salmon from the grocery wholesaler lasted weeks on the shelf. The patties could be shaped in the morning and kept cold until ordered. Frying took 4 minutes. The gravy took 3. A cook working alone could put this plate on the counter faster than any other hot meal, and it always sold. In cafes where the daily menu changed with the groceries, the salmon croquette plate was the one constant. Salmon croquettes belonged to Black cafes the way chop suey belonged to Chinese American restaurants, not because anyone invented the dish, but because the economics demanded it. Cheap protein, long shelf life, fast cook, and a flavor that travelers recognized from their own mother's kitchens. Comfort and efficiency on the same plate. After the cafes closed, salmon croquettes survived in home kitchens longer than almost anything else on this list. Grandmothers kept making them well into the 1990s, but canned salmon climbed from pennies to dollars a tin, and the next generation decided salmon should be grilled or baked. The croquette started to feel like something to apologize for. No single cook ever designed a more practical meal. The apology was the real waste. Number 18, liver pudding on white bread. Not liverwurst, not pate. Liver pudding was a Carolina specialty made by grinding cooked pork liver with cornmeal, sage, black pepper, and a pinch of red pepper flake, then pressing the mixture into a loaf and slicing it cold. Green Book cafes in the Piedmont region served it on soft white bread, sometimes with a smear of mayonnaise, sometimes plain. It was a working man's lunch, quick, filling, and dense enough to last until supper. The loaf sat in the icebox for a week. Without spoiling, one loaf made 20 sandwiches. Liver pudding still exists in small meat markets across eastern North Carolina today, but as a cafe dish served on a plate alongside a scoop of slaw, it vanished with the cafes that once listed it on their chalkboards. Number 17, Souse meat plate. Souse separated a real Green Book cafe from a place pretending to be one. Made from a whole hog's head, cleaned and boiled until the meat slid off the skull, then chopped fine with onion, vinegar, and hot pepper, packed into a loaf pan and chilled overnight. The gelatin from the bones held it firm. The cook sliced it cold and laid 2 slices on a plate with salt and crackers, mustard, and a pickle. No stove work at service time, no last-minute assembly. Souse sat ready in the icebox for a week. For a cafe run by one woman with no help, that mattered more than flavor. The taste was sharp, vinegary, and deeply porky. Travelers either ordered it by name or pushed the plate back at first sight. Souse meat left public dining entirely by the 1980s. Modern meat processors no longer sell whole hog heads to retail customers. The ingredient vanished before the recipe did. Number 16, red rice with smoked sausage. Low country food brought inland by black cooks who had moved from the Sea Islands to cities like Columbia and Atlanta. Rice cooked in tomato paste, onion, and the rendered fat of smoked sausage until every grain turned red and carried the smoke. Green Book cafes in South Carolina and coastal Georgia served it as a main dish, not a side, a full plate with 2 thick slices of sausage alongside. The dish traces its roots to West African jollof rice, though nobody in a 1950s cafe used that name. They called it red rice or Savannah rice or tomato rice. After desegregation, the cafes that served it closed, and red rice retreated to family reunions and church suppers. By the 2000s, even those gatherings had largely moved on. Number 15, pickled pig feet plate. A quart jar of pig feet sat on the counter of almost every Green Book cafe south of the Mason-Dixon line. The feet were split, boiled until tender, then packed into brine with vinegar, bay leaves, peppercorns, and red pepper flakes. Some cooks added cloves. The jar stayed at room temperature behind the register. A customer pointed, the cook fished one out with tongs, set it on a plate with saltine crackers and hot sauce, and that was the meal. No cooking required once the jar was filled. The pickled pig foot was the original ready-to-eat protein a century before the convenience store wrap sandwich. Pig feet are still sold in jars at some grocery stores today, but the practice of eating one off a cafe counter, standing up, cracker in one hand, has been extinct for decades. Number 14, beef tripe stew. The smell gave it away before the menu did. Tripe stew, simmering on the back burner of a Green Book cafe, was not a neutral aroma. It filled the room. Some travelers walked in and turned around. The ones who stayed knew exactly what they were eating because they had grown up with it. Beef tripe, the muscular lining of a cow's stomach, required more preparation than any other dish on a cafe menu. The raw tripe had to be scrubbed, soaked in salted water, scrubbed again, boiled for an hour to soften, drained, cut into squares, and then simmered for another 2 to 3 hours with tomatoes, potatoes, onions, celery, and a splash of hot sauce, a bay leaf if the cook had one. The process took all morning. Most cafes ran it once a week on the same day the fresh delivery came from the butcher. It could not sit overnight. It had to be served the day it was made or not at all. The customers who ordered tripe were loyal to the point of planning their travel around it. A truck driver passing through Tuscaloosa who knew a particular cafe on Greensboro Avenue made tripe stew on Thursdays would time his whole route for a Thursday. The dish was that personal. It was also deeply divisive. People who ate tripe loved tripe. People who did not consider it unthinkable. There was no mild opinion. When the cafes closed, tripe stew did not migrate to chain restaurants or revival menus. Tripe is still used in menudo and fio, but the Southern Black Cafe version, stewed thick with tomatoes and potatoes and no chili heat, has no public home left. It survives only in kitchens that are going quiet one by one. Number 13, stewed hen and drop dumplings. Not a young chicken, a hen, an old laying hen past her productive years, tough enough to resist any short cooking method. Green Book cafes bought spent hens from local farms for next to nothing because nobody else wanted them. The hen simmered in water with salt, pepper, celery, and an onion split down the middle until the meat separated into long strings. Then the dumplings. Flour, baking powder, salt, and a splash of the broth dropped by the spoonful into the bubbling liquid. The lid stayed on. 10 minutes later, the dumplings puffed thick. The dish tasted like the patience it took to make. Stewed hen disappeared for the simplest reason in American food history. Factory farming made young broiler chickens so cheap that nobody bothered with a tough old hen anymore. The economics shifted. The flavor was the cost. It is tempting to call these dishes lost. They are not lost. Lost implies they were misplaced, that someone set them down and forgot where. What happened to Green Book cafe food was not forgetfulness. It was a series of economic decisions that made perfect sense one at a time and erased an entire food culture all at once. Desegregation opened every restaurant in the country. Factory farming dropped the price of chicken. Interstate highways bypassed the towns where the cafes stood. Supermarkets replaced the open-air markets where cooks bought produce before dawn. Refrigeration made canning unnecessary. Convenience made patience expensive. Every one of those changes was progress, and every one of them took a small cafe in a small town and made it a little less necessary until one morning the cook did not unlock the door because there was nobody left coming through it. Number 12, hot water cornbread, not baked in a pan, not a muffin. Hot water cornbread was made by pouring boiling water over cornmeal, salt, and a pinch of sugar, stirring it into a thick paste, shaping it by hand into oblong patties, and frying them in deep oil until the outside turned into a shell and the inside stayed dense and slightly gummy. The boiling water was the key. It cooked the cornmeal before it touched the oil, which changed the texture entirely. Pan-baked cornbread crumbles apart. Hot water cornbread holds together like a fist. Green Book cafes serve 2 or 3 pieces alongside any plate as the bread course. No butter needed. The oil did the work. Hot water cornbread still survives in some homes across Mississippi and Alabama, but no restaurant serves it because every single piece must be shaped by hand. That labor does not scale. Number 11, chitlins plate, chitterlings, the clean small intestines of a hog, boiled and then fried or served in their own broth with vinegar and hot sauce on the side. In Green Book cafes, chitlins were a Saturday dish. The cleaning process alone took hours. Every section of intestine turned inside out, scraped, rinsed in cold water, scraped again, and rinsed until the water ran clear. The smell during cooking announced itself to the entire block. Cafes that served chitlins put a sign in the window on the mornings they had them. People came specifically for that sign. Chitlins were divisive then, and they remain divisive now, but the cafe-served version, plated with coleslaw and accrued of vinegar, has not existed as a commercial offering since the early 1970s. The dish went home and mostly stayed there. Number 10, crackling breads. When a hog was rendered for lard, the solid bits left behind after the fat melted were called cracklings. Crisp, salty, chewy, and packed with more flavor than any pork product that followed them. Green Book cafes in the Deep South mixed cracklings into cornbread batter and baked the whole thing in a skillet. The result was cornbread with veins of pork running through it, a bread that doubled as a meat course, a square of crackling bread alongside a bowl of greens, and the broth they simmer in made a complete meal. The cracklings gave the bread its name and its reason to exist. Today, almost nobody renders their own lard at home. The cracklings that made this bread possible do not exist without the rendering process that created them. The bread died with the practice. Number 9, fried rabbit. Before factory chicken, rabbit cost less than any other meat a Southern family could put on the table. A man with a rifle and an hour of daylight before supper could feed the house. Green Book cafes in rural Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas serve fried rabbit the same way they serve fried chicken, soaked in buttermilk, dredged in seasoned flour, and fried in a deep skillet. The meat was leaner, darker, and gamier than chicken. The bones were smaller and sharper. A fried rabbit plate came with 2 pieces, a biscuit, and a side of greens. By the late 1960s, supermarket chicken had gotten so cheap that rabbit lost its place on the menu. The last generation of cafe cooks who knew how to break down a whole rabbit retired without passing that knowledge forward. The skill left with them. Number 8, blackberry cobbler. Not a bakery cobbler with lattice crust and measured sugar. Green Book cafe cobbler was wild blackberries picked that morning, dumped into a baking pan with sugar and a squeeze of lemon, topped with a batter of flour, butter, sugar, and milk, and baked until the fruit bubbled up through the crust and stained it purple. The proportions changed every time depending on how many berries the cook had gathered. Some versions were more crust than berry. Some were more berry than crust. Both were correct. Cobbler was served warm, with nothing on top or with a scoop of vanilla ice cream if the cafe owned a freezer. The version made from wild berries, measured by eye, baked without a written recipe, is gone. Commercial cobbler uses cultivated fruit and printed instructions. It tastes clean where the old version tasted wild. Number 7, neckbone purloo. Purloo was the Low Country's answer to the one-pot meal. Rice cooked in seasoned broth with whatever meat the cook had on hand. In Green Book cafes along the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, the meat was almost always pork neck bones, because neck bones were worth so little that butchers sometimes threw them in free with a larger order, and they flavored rice better than any expensive cut could. The cook started early. Neck bones hit the stock pot at 6 in the morning, covered in water with salt, pepper, a whole onion, and a celery stalk. By 10, the broth was rich and dark, and the meat had loosened from the small, awkward bones. The cook pulled the bones out, stripped the meat by hand, and returned it to the pot. Then the rice, long grain Carolina rice, unwashed, stirred once, and left alone under a heavy lid. 20 minutes later, every grain sat separate, not sticky, carrying broth and fat. A plate of neckbone purloo cost 35 cents and kept a traveler full long enough to drive another 200 miles without stopping. Every ingredient was either dried or nearly free: rice, salt, pepper, onion. The only thing that needed to be fresh was the neck bones, and those arrived every morning. After the cafes closed, Perlou survived in home kitchens across the Sea Islands. Families made it for funerals and reunions. But neck bones followed oxtails up the price ladder, and the dish that once cost less than a loaf of bread became something people thought twice about making. The last cafe that served Perlou as a daily plate closed before most people alive today ever tasted it. Number 6, ham hock and lima bean soup. One smoked ham hock and a pound of dried lima beans could feed a dozen travelers. Green Book cafes knew that arithmetic by heart. The hock simmered for an hour until the meat loosened and the broth turned cloudy with gelatin. Then the beans, soaked overnight, joined with salt, pepper, and a bay leaf. The soup thickened on its own as the beans broke apart. No flour, no cream. The starch did all the work. The soup could sit on low heat from morning until close without losing its body, which made it the perfect dish for a cafe that served from noon to 9. This soup has no modern equivalent. Canned bean soup does not carry the depth of a real smoked hock, and no restaurant today would invest 6 hours in a bowl of beans. Number 5, streakoline with turnip greens. Streakoline was the narrow cut of salt pork that ran between pure fat and lean meat, not bacon, not fatback. The strip in between with just enough lean to count as food and just enough fat to season an entire pot of greens without anything else added. Green Book cafes served streakoline fried crisp alongside a bowl of turnip greens that had simmered for hours in the drippings. The greens came with their broth and a piece of cornbread for soaking it up. This was a meal built entirely on pork and greens, nothing else needed. Streakoline has nearly vanished from meat counters today. The cut requires a specific breakdown of the hog that modern processing plants skip entirely. Without the cut, the dish cannot be made the way it was made. It is not forgotten, it is structurally extinct. Number 4, molasses pie. Before refined sugar was cheap, molasses sweetened everything in the South. Molasses pie was the simplest dessert on any Green Book cafe menu and the cheapest to make. Molasses, eggs, a little butter, vanilla, and a pinch of salt poured into a single crust and baked until the filling set firm and the top turned glossy. The taste was dark, nearly bitter, with a mineral depth that sugar pies never carried. It paired with black coffee the way pecan pie pairs with whipped cream today. Molasses pie disappeared for the same reason molasses left most Southern kitchens. Refined sugar became cheaper by the mid-1960s, and the regional palate shifted with it. The South moved from dark and complex to bright and sweet. The pie followed the dark. Number 3, smothered pork chop plate. A pork chop dredged in seasoned flour, browned hard on both sides, then buried under a lid with sliced onions and enough water to build a gravy as the flour dissolved and thickened in the pan. Smothered. The word meant covered, sealed, steamed in its own heat until the meat surrendered. Green Book cafes served the smothered pork chop plate with rice or mashed potatoes and a vegetable on the side. It was the closest thing to a Sunday dinner a traveler could buy on a Tuesday. The chop was always bone-in because boneless chops were a factory invention that came later. The gravy was always slightly lumpy because smooth gravy meant a cook who reached for a packet mix, and Green Book cooks did not reach for mixes. The cafe version, built from hand-cut chops and pan-made gravy by a cook who treated shortcuts as insults, vanished when prepackaged seasoning mixes and boneless cuts took over the kitchen. The smothering stopped when the patience did. Number 2, fried catfish with comeback sauce. Catfish pulled from the river that morning, filleted at the cafe, dredged in yellow cornmeal with salt and cayenne, and fried until the coating cracked at the touch of a fork. Green Book cafes along the Mississippi River served catfish the way coastal places served shrimp. It was the house dish, the reason travelers pulled off the highway. Comeback sauce was a Mississippi original, a pink dressing mixed from mayonnaise, ketchup, Worcestershire sauce, garlic, paprika, and lemon juice. The name said what it meant. A catfish plate with comeback sauce, coleslaw, and hush puppies at a cafe near Greenville in 1956 cost 65 cents. The river-caught, cornmeal-only, skillet-fried catfish served with real comeback sauce vanished when the cafes did. Farm-raised fish replaced the wild catch. Deep fryers replaced the skillet. The sauce went with the cook who mixed it by hand. Number 1, egg custard pie. 4 eggs, a cup of sugar, a cup of milk, a pat of butter, a scrape of nutmeg, and a single pie crust. That was the entire recipe. Green Book Cafe cooks made egg custard pie because it asked for nothing that was not already in the kitchen. No fruit to go bad, no chocolate to buy, no cream to whip. The filling baked smooth and golden, barely sweet, with a wobble at the center when the cook pulled it from the oven. It was the last course on a 50-cent plate lunch, and it tasted like someone cared enough to make dessert from almost nothing. Egg custard pie did not survive the arrival of sweeter, showier pies. Sweet potato, pecan, lemon meringue. The custard pie had no spectacle, no tower of meringue, no lattice crust. It relied entirely on the quality of 4 eggs and the hand of the cook who tempered them. Every dish on this list followed the same path, not replaced because it failed, but because something louder came along. Number 9, blackstrap molasses on a split biscuit. This was the breakfast your grandmother's grandmother knew. A woman in Tuskegee, Alabama, would split a hot biscuit in half, lay a smear of butter on each side, then pour a slow circle of blackstrap molasses over the top until the bread turned dark and glossy. Blackstrap molasses was the last boiling of sugar cane juice, the darkest and most bitter of the 3 grades, and it was the cheapest sweetener available to black families in the rural South. A Department of Agriculture study in the 1890s found that fat salt pork, cornmeal, and molasses were the 3 staple foods in black households around Tuskegee. 60 years later, in the 1950s, that had barely changed. Molasses was still there on the breakfast table. The flavor was strong and earthy, almost medicinal. Children who grew up eating it either loved it or learned to love it because there was nothing else sweet in the house. When refined sugar became cheap, molasses lost its place. But it had carried generations.
Sweet potato biscuits were a creative way of stretching precious wheat flour while using what gardens could provide in abundance. Sweet potatoes, easy to grow and store, became the secret ingredient that gave biscuits sweetness, color, and body. Mothers mashed them into dough, adding just enough flour and fat to create something tender and warm. These biscuits filled kitchens with comfort and provided fuel for long days of work. They were served at breakfast with sorghum syrup or eaten at supper alongside beans or greens. For many families, they became an affordable luxury, a way to bring a little sweetness to the table without relying on expensive sugar. Children loved them for their soft texture and unique flavor, and adults valued how far they could stretch ingredients. Sweet potato biscuits were more than clever cooking. They represented a balance of necessity and creativity, proof that even in the toughest times, resourcefulness could create moments of joy.
Number 15, smothered turkey wings. A pound of fresh turkey wings cost 19 cents at the meat counter in 1957. Most white shoppers passed the wings by because they didn't know what to do with them. Your grandmother knew exactly what to do. She washed the wings in cold water, dredged them in flour, seasoned with salt, black pepper, garlic powder, and a pinch of poultry seasoning, and browned them in a skillet of bacon grease until the skin was crisp like paper. Then the wings went into a deep pot with 2 yellow onions, 3 stalks of celery, and 4 cups of water. The lid went on. The pot simmered on the back burner for 2.5 hours. By supper time, the meat was falling off the bone and the broth had turned into a thick mahogany gravy. She served the wings over rice with the gravy ladled across both. 6 children licked their fingers clean. You'd watch the wing bones get picked over twice.
Country ham and red-eye gravy brought a different kind of Christmas flavor, bold, smoky, and unforgettable. Grandparents fried thick slices of ham until the edges crisped, then poured in strong black coffee to make the gravy. The sizzle was sharp, the smell rich and salty with a whisper of bitterness. The gravy was thin, almost see-through, but it carried flavor strong enough to wake the soul. Poured over biscuits or grits, it turned breakfast into something fierce and proud. It was food for people who worked hard, who earned their rest on cold winter mornings. The taste of ham met the bite of coffee in a balance that only tradition could teach. It wasn't sweet or fancy, it was real. Country ham and red-eye gravy reminded everyone that even leftover meat could become something special when cooked with skill and care. It was strength served on a plate. Cornbread skillet bread was the backbone of countless meals, baked right in heavy cast-iron pans that turned simple batter into golden, hearty wedges. Made from cornmeal, water, salt, and whatever fat was on hand, it could be cooked quickly and fed an entire family. When wheat flour was too expensive, cornbread became the daily bread that anchored suppers and breakfasts alike. Its dense texture soaked up potlikker from greens, carried gravies, and stretched stews into something more filling. Families treasured it because it required almost no special ingredients, just the basics from fields and pantries. Sweetened versions were rare in poor households, where every grain of sugar was saved, so the bread was most often savory and practical. Served hot from the skillet, it provided warmth and comfort on cold nights, eaten plain or with a dab of molasses if someone was lucky. Cornbread skillet bread was not just a side, it was survival itself, versatile, cheap, and woven into the rhythm of life.
Number 13, fatback and grits. If you grew up in a sharecropper's household in Georgia or South Carolina in the 1940s, your morning started the same way every day: a slice of fatback fried in a cast iron skillet until the edges curled and the grease pooled. Then a bowl of grits cooked in water with that rendered fat stirred through. Fatback cost almost nothing because white families did not want it. Butchers sold it for pennies a pound, and the salt preserved it for months. For black children, this was breakfast every single day. Not sometimes, every day. The fat kept you full through hours of walking miles to the segregated school that had no cafeteria. Nutritionists would later call this diet deficient. The families who survived on it called it Tuesday. Number 12, cold grits cakes provided portable lunches made from leftover breakfast grits that would otherwise go to waste. Number 7, fried cornmeal mush. This was the breakfast that required a full day of planning and vanished the morning after the woman who made it was gone. A woman in Macon, Georgia, would boil cornmeal in water the night before until it thickened into a dense porridge. She poured it into a bread pan and set it in the icebox overnight. In the morning, she turned the chilled block of mush out onto a board, sliced it into half-inch slabs, dredged each one in a little more cornmeal, and fried the slices in bacon grease until they were golden and crisp on the outside and soft like custard inside. She served them stacked on a plate with butter and sorghum syrup or cane syrup poured over the top. The mush soaked up the sweetness the way a sponge takes water. Children ate it with their hands. The whole plate cost less than a nickel. This is the breakfast that tells you everything about what we lost. The woman in Macon knew things about cornmeal that a recipe card could not hold. She knew how long to stir the pot before the mush was thick enough to set. She knew the exact amount of water by the way the cornmeal resisted the spoon. She knew that the slices had to be cold all the way through or they would fall apart in the pan. None of that was written down. All of it lived in her hands. When she passed, her daughter tried to make fried mush from a recipe she found in a church cookbook. The mush was too thin. It would not hold. The slices broke in the skillet. The daughter called her sister and said, "I do not know how Mama did it." And the sister said, "Nobody does." That was 1971. The mush never came back to that kitchen.
Red beans and rice stood tall as one of the most efficient meals of the 1950s, capable of feeding large families for days with minimal cost. The beans offered protein, the rice added bulk, and together they created a complete, filling dish that sustained both body and spirit. Cooked slowly on the stove, beans became creamy and flavorful, often seasoned with onions, garlic, or a scrap of ham bone if it was available. It was the kind of recipe that rewarded patience, turning the cheapest staples into something deeply satisfying. Mothers made huge pots that could stretch through several meals, reheated each day with flavors that only grew richer. For many, it was a taste of home and community, often served during gatherings where neighbors shared what little they had. Beyond nourishment, it was practical, because rice and beans were cheap, stored well, and required no complicated cooking. Red beans and rice became more than food. It was proof that with little, families could still find abundance and flavor.
Number 21, stewed cabbage with fatback. A whole green cabbage at the farmer's market in Macon ran 6 cents in 1955. A 4-inch slab of fatback from the smokehouse cost a nickel. Your grandmother quartered the cabbage on the wooden cutting board, peeled away the outer leaves she would feed to the chickens, and cut the rest into rough wedges. The fatback went into the bottom of the heavy pot first, sliced thin like ribbons so it would render without scorching. She laid the cabbage on top, poured in 2 cups of water, and clamped the lid. The pot simmered on the back of the wood stove for an hour and a half while she ironed her good dress for church. By the time she lifted the lid, the cabbage had collapsed into a soft, salty heap. The potlikker at the bottom looked like strong coffee. She ladled the cabbage and the broth into deep bowls and laid a wedge of cornbread on the rim of each. 5 children ate well for under 15 cents. The dish traveled from a Georgia kitchen in 1955 to a Detroit kitchen in 1972 to a kitchen in the Bronx in 1989. It was good.
Fatback and grits was breakfast built on thrift and grit. The fatback sizzled in the skillet first, releasing its salty aroma as it browned and curled. The grease left behind became gold, seasoning the pot of bubbling grits to perfection. Stirred smooth, thick, and rich, the grits soaked up that savory flavor like a secret only the poor could afford to know. Grandparents served it in bowls, steaming and simple, with crispy bits of fatback on top. It was heavy in the best way, fuel for a long day of labor. There was pride in every bite, the kind of pride that came from making much out of little. Fatback and grits was not just breakfast. It was strength served with a spoon, a southern hymn sung over a hot stove. Sometimes a pat of margarine was dropped on top to melt into the heat, adding a layer of richness that made the bowl glisten. The meal was eaten slow, savoring every spoonful before the workday began. Grandparents said it was food that stuck to your ribs, and they were right. It kept you going long after sunrise. It tasted like memory and perseverance, like something deeper than hunger itself. Collard greens with salt pork were a survival dish that filled pots across black households in the 1950s, stretching meager ingredients into meals that lasted for days. Salt pork scraps, often overlooked by wealthier buyers, flavored the greens with smoky richness while providing just enough fat to make them satisfying. The collards themselves were homegrown or picked up cheaply from markets, making the dish accessible even when money was scarce. Mothers and grandmothers simmered the pot for hours, letting the greens soften and soak in every bit of flavor. The broth, called potlikker, was prized for its nutrients and sopped up with cornbread, so nothing was wasted. For many families, this dish was not just food, but medicine, a way of keeping strength up through lean times. It carried cultural pride as much as it carried nourishment, representing both resilience and resourcefulness. Today, collard greens remain a staple, but few remember that in the 1950s, they were lifelines, simmered with love and scraps to keep families strong through hardship.
Number 11, cornbread dressing. This was the dish that caused family arguments at Thanksgiving, but it appeared on Sunday tables all through the fall and winter. A woman in Macon, Georgia, made cornbread a day ahead, crumbled it by hand, and mixed it with celery, onion, sage, boiled eggs, and chicken broth from scratch. The proportion of bread to broth was the whole secret, and she knew it by the feel of the mixture in her hands. Too dry and it crumbled on your plate, too wet and it turned to mush. She squeezed a handful, and if it held together but still felt light, the ratio was right. No recipe could teach you that. It was knowledge that lived in a woman's fingers, passed from mother to daughter by standing side by side in the kitchen. The sage was the signature. Too much, and it tasted like medicine. Too little, and it tasted like wet bread. Her amount was perfect, and she could not have told you what it was. Number 8, sweet potato biscuits. These biscuits were the color of sunset. A woman in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, would mash a roasted sweet potato into her biscuit dough, working it in with her hands until the dough turned a soft orange. She rolled them out, cut them with a glass, and baked them in a wood-fired oven until they puffed up golden. The sweet potato made the biscuit softer, moister, and slightly sweeter than a regular buttermilk biscuit. It also stretched the flour. One sweet potato could add enough bulk to a batch of dough to make 6 extra biscuits. In the 1950s, North Carolina was already the largest sweet potato producer in the country, and black families grew them in their own gardens. The sweet potato was free. The flour was cheap. Your grandmother used everything she grew. These biscuits did not survive the convenience era. People wanted biscuits from a tube, from a can, from a freezer. Nobody wanted to mash a potato first. That was too much work for something beautiful.
Pig's feet. Stew was the definition of making do with what others threw away, transforming discarded cuts into rich, savory meals. Pig's feet, cheap and often overlooked, were simmered for hours until the meat turned tender and the broth deep with flavor. Families paired it with vegetables like onions, carrots, or potatoes if they had them, stretching the stew further. The collagen from the feet created a thick, silky broth that felt more luxurious than the ingredients suggested. In many communities, this dish became a quiet source of pride, proving that nothing needed to be wasted. It reflected a deep cultural knowledge of how to coax nourishment from humble parts of the animal, keeping bellies full when options were few. Often served with cornbread, it was hearty enough to carry families through cold evenings and lean times. Pig's feet. Stew may not have looked glamorous, but it told a story of resilience and survival that carried across generations.
Streako lean. This was the meat that built the South, and nobody talks about it anymore. A woman in Durham, North Carolina, would take a slab of salt-cured pork, soak it in milk for an hour to draw out the brine, slice it thin, dredge it in flour, and fry it in a skillet until the edges were crisp and the fat turned translucent. She served it alongside eggs and biscuits. That was a working man's breakfast. Salt pork had been a staple in North Carolina since colonial times. It went by a dozen names: fatback, side meat, white bacon, midland meat. The meat itself was mostly fat with a thin streak of lean running through it, which is where the name streak of lean came from. In the 1950s, it was one of the cheapest proteins you could buy. A piece of salt pork flavored everything it touched, from breakfast to a pot of greens. By the 1980s, doctors had declared war on pork fat, and streako lean slowly vanished from the morning plate. Your grandmother never got the memo.
Black-eyed pea soup was a staple of lean nights, a protein-packed dish that provided comfort and sustenance when little else was available. Black-eyed peas, affordable and widely grown, simmered into a hearty soup that warmed families from the inside out. The dish was often flavored with onions, garlic, or scraps of cured meat, though it was nourishing even when cooked plain. Served with cornbread or rice, it created a meal that was simple, filling, and reliable. For many, it also carried symbolic meaning, tied to traditions of luck and prosperity. During the 1950s, however, it was primarily survival food, proof of how communities could thrive on legumes that kept costs low. Children grew up on the earthy taste of the soup, and families relied on it to stretch thin pantries. Black-eyed pea soup was both medicine and meal, a dish that blended culture and necessity while keeping countless families strong through hard times.
Families poured leftover grits into pans to set overnight, then sliced the firm mixture into squares and fried them golden the next morning. These cakes could be eaten hot for breakfast or packed cold for midday meals, their dense texture holding up through hours in lunch pails. The process transformed cheap cornmeal into something more substantial than porridge. Workers carried grits cakes knowing they would fill hungry stomachs when no other food was available. Some families added bacon or cheese when affordable, but plain grits cakes provided satisfying carbohydrates without additions. The technique represented kitchen wisdom passed between generations of Black women who understood creativity conquered poverty. 25 plates that left no recipe card behind. The cooks who made them measured with a palm and tasted from a spoon. If one dish on this list is worth trying this week, start with hot water cornbread or molasses pie. Both need nothing more than what is already in the kitchen. If one of these cafes fed someone in your family, put the name of the town in the comments. Those counter seats deserve a record. The Green Book stopped printing in 1966. The cafes went dark one by one after that, but a catfish plate in Greenville or a bowl of Perleau on the Carolina coast did more than fill a stomach on a dangerous highway. It told a stranger that somebody on the other side of that counter cared whether they made it home. That is what vanished. Not the recipes, the hands that made them.